Okay. Oh, sorry. We started. Okay. So here's the second part of Reagan that we wanted to do. So we were talking about Jerry Falwell and the new right, so the far right. So conservatives, um, during this time period, you had a growth of this. Remember, in the 60s and 70s, we saw government doing a lot of spending, and you're going to see a push by some people and a move by some people to the right, and the really conservatives to the far right were known as the new right. Okay, and what are people into for this? They want business to grow, taxes to be lower, and free enterprise. So what they mean by that is during the 70s, I think it was 1979, the EPA and OSHA were both formed. So the Environmental Protection Agency. Actually, that was formed sooner than that because it was under Nixon. Um, so the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and also the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they both push for a lot of regulation in business. So I think we talked a little bit about this in class. Like now, instead of just for factories, just eliminating like dumping their waste in the waters, the streams, the ponds, the lakes, whatever near them, you have to dispose of it properly so it doesn't harm the environment. Well, that's great, but it certainly costs a lot of money to do that stuff. So the new right, the Republicans who are very conservative during this time, they don't like all of this regulation. They're for big business and they want it to be easier for big business to do big business. And the more regulations that the government puts on business, the more costly and more expensive it is. They would rather see, they and Reagan would rather see money that businesses have be spent on creating more business instead of following regulations, if that makes sense. And he also wants to offer tax cuts to these businesses and to people too, so that when people get tax cuts, then they can spend more money. And he thinks spending more money will stimulate the economy. So tax cuts and free enterprise, free business. Deregulation, we call it deregulation of business. And Reagan's and the far right are also for spending a lot of money on national defense. Okay. I think we talked about too that Reagan had been an actor. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was the governor of California, a really amiable, good personality. They called him the great communicator. He was great in a debate, really good. He's going to beat Carter by a landslide. And also, he asked this question, and people really think about it. And this was more powerful, probably, than anything else he said in his debates. And he kept saying, "Are you better today than you were 4 years ago?" And that's speaking to the beginning when Jimmy Carter first became president. Because, during Carter's presidency, we have the energy crisis and we have stagflation. So economically, people are in a bad position as a nation. Jimmy Carter with his foreign policy in the Middle East. There were a lot of embargoes that OPEC and the oil producing countries were putting on the United States because they were mad at us. And, Carter's solution was telling Americans that perhaps they should use less oil and conserve. And I think we talked about his malaise speech. He gives a speech they come to coin the malaise speech, where he says, basically wear a sweater. Like he tells people that they're being basically babies about the energy crisis and everybody could just use a little bit less stuff. And he just, has old fashioned values. And I think he meant well. And he certainly, people can be more conservative in what they use. But that wasn't what people wanted to hear. They were tired of the inflation. They were tired of the price of costs and goods going up and not their salaries. So when Reagan said, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" it really hit home for a lot of people, clearly because he's going to win the 1980 election by a landslide. Carter only carried 3 states, one of which was his home state of Georgia. And he is also, how many electoral votes? Wow. Jimmy Carter got 538 electoral votes. That's a lot. So, or Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan got, that's a lot. So you could tell that the country was up for change. Okay. So guys, if you, like, how I always say you should know, like, the points of view, people's points of view. So Reagan would be the opposite of like FDR, say. Okay, remember we said, and I've probably said this 50 times, but the New Deal made the government bigger, much bigger, and more involved in the personal lives of people. Reagan is not into social welfare programs at all. And he is not into big business. He's actually, another quote he always said was, uh, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Okay. So to him, government is too big and too interfering in business. Okay. Reagan's very pro business, and he doesn't want the government to be involved in creating all kinds of regulations. He believes that that stifles productivity. And I think we talked about Reaganomics or trickle down economics or supply side economics, where if you make it cheaper to do business, people can do more business. Okay. Some of the things he cuts, guys, are Medicaid, which we know was created by Lyndon B. Johnson, part of the Great Society. So all that Great Society spending, all that war on poverty spending, all of the Vietnam War spending, all that stuff has gotten out of hand. Now, Reagan, like we said, is going to spend a ton of money on defense, but anything else he doesn't want to spend money on because he feels it interferes with the free enterprise. Okay, so deregulation of industry is something that the new right, that the conservatives, that the Republicans in the 1980s would go for. Okay, the Environmental Protection Agency. So all this stuff, by doing deregulation, it did increase competition, it did lower prices, and allowed people to have more access to certain resources. Okay. Okay. Did we talk about Sandra Day O'Connor? He's going to nominate the first female ever to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. Okay, he has a chance to put a lot of conservatives on the court, and what is significant is Sandra Day. Okay, so by 1980, when Reagan is elected, you do see how high the inflation and the employment rates were. The employment rate looks to be about 7 or 8%. Okay, and inflation is way up there. Okay. In 1980, so interest on loans, that's really high, 20%, like mortgages and things like that. Like today, most people's mortgages, the interest rate is like 3 to 5%. You can get a really low one, so 20% is astronomical. And the value of our dollar had dropped tremendously. Okay, and this is just the supply side economic theory. This is very no one's going to ask you about this. This is the Laffer curve, the whole thing. This is in economics class. If we were taking economics, we might get really into this. But basically, what we need to know, I guess, supply side economics for dummies. Not that you're dumb, but we don't need to know this. This isn't AP Econ. But basically, supply side economics is when you cut the cost of doing business, it's going to allow business to do more business. And the idea is that the money will trickle down to people. Okay. And it doesn't always happen, but it does sometimes stimulate things. Okay. So Reagan believed that the economy was killed and it was killed in the 70s, and taxes were way too high. And when people are spending all that money on taxes, they don't have money in their pockets. The whole thing with stimulating the economy is to try and find a way to get more money in people's pockets. When people have money in their pockets, they spend it, and that gets the economy stimulated. Okay, so he does have a plan for a 25% tax cut over the course of 3 years. Okay, they call it Reaganomics, which is the supply side economics or trickle down economics. Okay, it did work in the 83. Stagflation ended and the economy boomed, but P.S. it's going to create a big deficit later, because a deficit occurs when you don't take enough taxes in and you're spending more. So when all these years in the 80s of lower taxes, the government is not collecting as much money, and then he's going to start spending a lot of money. While he doesn't spend it on social welfare programs, he's going to spend a tremendous amount of money on quote unquote Star Wars or the Strategic Defense Initiative. Okay. And unemployment falls, which is great, and inflation declined. Okay. So what is SDI? Let's get ahead to that. Does that? Okay. Well, all right. We'll talk about some of the social problems that people felt Reagan sort of ignored. One was Um, one was the school situation. We are behind other nations in school, especially in science and math. So they're going to start looking at that, especially after an expose. This would be like a muckraking piece. A book called A Nation at Risk was written, and that's going to put a little fire under us. We're really going to see not until like George W. Bush does the No Child Left Behind. So like PSSAs and people went to public school to take PSSA testing or Keystones, any kind of state testing. I mean, education is the states are responsible for education. It's funded by the states, but a lot of the schools do get, public schools do get federal money. If you're a school that accepts federal money, you have to participate, which is every public school. You have to participate in the standards that were set and the testing. And if your students don't do well in the testing, a school can be closed. Okay, so that stuff comes from George W. Bush, but it's here that we're realizing that we need to do more with education. Okay, but it doesn't really come to him. There is a huge homeless epidemic during the 80s. A lot of these guys that were homeless in the 80s were, in fact, veterans of the Vietnam War who never got the right kind of mental health help that they needed. But I'm not saying every homeless person was a vet, but there were a lot of them because at that point, those guys are, if the war was over in 73, in the 80s, maybe that's when they're starting to struggle. They lose their jobs and it just snowballs. But there's a lot of just people who are homeless in general. It was a major problem in the 80s. And people felt like Reagan wasn't really doing enough. There's also a huge problem with or not a problem with it, but people are divided on how they feel about affirmative action. Affirmative action was something that started back with Nixon, had a thing called the Philadelphia Plan, where he was trying to get more African Americans into certain jobs and minorities in general. And the push for affirmative action by now is pretty big, and some people who are on the far right in the conservative side might not like that, so people are attacking that. Okay. Also, too, there's a lot of poverty. Reagan was what they call like a big law and order man. They wanted to crack down on criminals, okay, be more aggressive. Also, too, there's a huge problem with AIDS in the 1980s, and because AIDS, the first few cases were reported by gay males. AIDS had a connotation to be a disease of the gay community, and therefore those on the far right who were very conservative, who were anti-homosexual, were going to have a problem with that. So Reagan didn't, and that was a big part of his following. People who are critics of Reagan said he didn't do enough to help. Now, a lot's been done since then with AIDS, and there's a lot of medicines that are available to help people live. But back then when you got it, it was basically a death sentence, and there wasn't enough research, and it was very problematic. Okay. All right. And those are the diagnosis and the deaths so it was pretty consistent that you would die, but you see it's tapered off in the 2000s, the death. Okay. So, okay. Also, too, a major problem with drugs. In fact, that became Nancy Reagan's thing. Remember, I told you that first lady, starting with Eleanor Roosevelt, all the first ladies have like a cause that they dedicate themselves to. And Nancy Reagan's was just say no to drugs because there was a huge crack cocaine epidemic. In the 80s, they figured out how to make crack cocaine, which was extremely cheap. It was a lot cheaper to buy than regular cocaine. And it was something that it's kind of like today with the opioids and the painkillers that are easily accessible. That's how crack was in the 80s. And a lot of people were addicted to it. And we start the war on drugs and the just say no. I remember growing up in the 80s, there were a lot of commercials about, anti-drug campaigns. Okay. So we're going to run out of time here soon, but the election of 84, Reagan's going to run and he's going to win. He's going to beat Walter Mondale, and Geraldine Ferraro was the first female to run for vice president, and Reagan and Bush are going to win. Okay. So he goes into his second look. He wins by even more this time, all but Walter Mondale's home state. Okay. All right. So I do want to do Reagan and foreign policy, so I guess I'm going to have to do one more recording. So I'm going to stop here and we'll talk about how Reagan ends the Cold War. Okay. I know you've been dying all year to find out how it ends. it's the end of the story, really. Um, so I'll sign off.